Africa is increasingly coming under Russian influence. In addition to the Chinese, it is Vladimir Putin in particular who wants to fill the power vacuum in Africa. For example, an entire state, the Central African Republic, is almost completely under Russian control. Locally, much of the people see the Russians as liberators and support their attack on Ukraine. And in other unstable regions of Africa, more and more states are turning away from the West and celebrating Russia as their new protective power. But how did Russia gain so much influence in Africa? What strategy is it pursuing? And what are the prospects for the future? We will look at all of these questions in today's video. Russia has only been interested in Africa again for a good 10 years and has made clever use of its contacts with former partner states from the Soviet era, such as South Africa and Angola. Trade agreements were concluded, but unlike the West, Russia did not ask any questions about human rights or the political system. The African states were primarily interested in weapons, so that almost half of the arms exports to Africa now come from Russia. In return, Russian companies often received easier access to raw materials, or entire swaths of lands were sold directly to Russian companies, which naturally led to a steady increase in Russia's influence. One country in which the Russian strategy is particularly evident is the Central African Republic. The country gained its independence from France in 1960, but in the time that followed there were repeated coups, military revolts and overthrows, which is why the country is today considered one of the poorest countries in the world, despite its natural resources. Thus, a brutal civil war broke out in the country again in 2013. Even the French soldiers stationed there failed to achieve lasting peace, which is why the new president, elected in 2016, turned to Russia. This came in handy for Russia to further expand its influence, and it supplied the African state with weapons and sent military advisors to the country starting in 2018. The Wagner Group is a particularly important tool in this regard, a private Russian security firm which mercenaries often take care of Russia's dirty business abroad. For example, more than 1,000 mercenaries are reportedly stationed in the Central African Republic to maintain law and order there. Russia thus keeps the country's ruler in power, trains the military, and drives the rebels out to remote parts of the country. However, a UN expert group reports mass executions, torture and forced displacement of the civilian population. In return, the Russians have a virtually free hand in the state, and the Russian companies have a monopoly on the mining of the country's raw materials, which is secured by the Wagner Group. However, the Central African Republic is only one of many states in which Russia is increasingly gaining influence. In the meantime, the mercenaries of the Wagner Group, also known as the Shadow Army, are said to be active in 23 African countries, but also outside of Africa, for example in Syria and Ukraine. And that brings us to the strategy that Putin is linking to this. Through the influence that Russia gains through its operations in the African states, he creates allies for himself, and through targeted propaganda, the population in many countries sees Russia as a liberator. The increasingly isolated Putin is thus gaining votes and allies at the United States and can increasingly push Western states like France out of Africa. The West seems to be increasingly overwhelmed with the situation in Africa, which is why more and more troops are being withdrawn or expelled from the country by the rulers there. A good example of this is Mali. Here, the French were called in 2013 for help against the jihadist uprisings. In 2020, however, the government was overthrown and the demonstrators waved Russian flags and portraits of Putin, who was supposed to finally bring peace to the country. As a result, the Wagner Group was sent to the country to prop up the new military government and maintain law and order in the country. And France then withdrew all troops from Mali. A similar picture is emerging in other African countries, which is why Russia is gaining more and more influence there. However, it must also be said that Russia is currently extremely weakened by the many setbacks in Ukraine, which is why it is uncertain to what extent it can continue to maintain its involvement in Africa. Nevertheless, this did not stop the Russians from removing Burkina Faso, another African country, from the European sphere of influence a few weeks ago. France, however, seems to have recognized the seriousness of the situation and is now increasingly turning its attention back to West Africa. Macron countered Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov's trips to Africa with his own trip to Africa, and France is now actively trying to counter Russian propaganda in Africa. So there's a lot of competition going on in Africa right now, and it remains to be seen in which direction Africa will swing, especially under the influence of China, which we haven't even talked about yet. And since other countries like Turkey and India also want to expand their influence in the region, but that would definitely be material for a video of its own. So that was it with the video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you want to hear more about Africa, I can recommend you my video about the Austrian colonies in Africa. Enjoy the video and see you next time.